At 7:42 a.m. in Washington, the silence inside the Trade Coordination Room became more alarming than the shouting that had preceded it. A senior Treasury official lowered a pen onto a leather briefing folder and stared toward the screen without blinking. Two phones vibrated almost simultaneously. No one reached for them. Across the table, an advisor quietly whispered a single sentence that would later appear in three separate intelligence summaries before noon. Canada isn't backing down. Outside the White House, cameras were already gathering behind steel barricades. Futures markets were falling in pre-market trading. Currency desks in London had begun repositioning before North America was fully awake. In Ottawa, motorcades moved through wet streets toward Parliament Hill under gray skies while television anchors spoke in increasingly careful language. The situation was no longer being described as a trade disagreement. It was becoming a sovereign confrontation. And somewhere between the pressure campaign, the retaliatory threats, the private negotiations, and the public escalation, Donald Trump encountered the kind of response he almost never faced in international politics, a leader who refused to react emotionally. That changed the entire equation. The first indications appeared subtle, almost invisible in fact. No dramatic speeches, no public insults, no emergency press conference designed for television clips. Instead, Mark Carney responded with something colder: institutional coordination, controlled messaging, delayed retaliation, quiet conversations with central banks, trade ministries, pension funds, sovereign investors, and allied governments. The strategy did not look aggressive. That was precisely why it became dangerous. Because markets understand something politicians often do not. Volume is not leverage. Pressure is not always power. An escalation only works when the other side accepts your timeline. Carney did not. Inside diplomatic circles, officials later described the response as unusually disciplined. One European trade negotiator privately remarked that the Canadian government behaved less like a wounded ally and more like a risk management institution. That distinction mattered. Governments can posture, institutions calculate. And calculations were already spreading through the global financial system. Within hours of the first retaliatory signals, analysts at three major investment banks began revising North American growth forecasts. Currency strategists flagged rising governance risk premiums. Bond traders started discussing the possibility that prolonged bilateral instability could damage long-term capital confidence across multiple sectors simultaneously. The problem was larger than tariffs. The problem was unpredictability. Markets can survive conflict. They rarely survive unpredictability. In public, Trump projected confidence. He spoke the language he had always relied on: leverage, pressure, dominance, victory. Advisors close to the administration believed Canada would eventually absorb the pressure rather than risk broader economic damage. After all, the United States economy was nearly 10 times larger. American consumer markets remained critical to Canadian exports. The imbalance appeared overwhelming on paper, but power often mistakes size for durability. What many officials underestimated was the degree to which modern economic systems depend on institutional trust rather than raw scale alone. Canada understood this. Carney understood it better than almost anyone in global politics. Because before he entered Canadian leadership, he had spent years inside the machinery of international finance itself: central banking, sovereign stability frameworks, crisis management, liquidity systems, market psychology. He understood how investors react when governments appear impulsive. He understood how allies behave when economic relationships become politically weaponized. Most importantly, he understood timing, and timing became the battlefield. At 11:16 a.m., according to later reporting from diplomatic staffers, a private call between senior U.S. and Canadian officials became noticeably more tense after Ottawa refused immediate concessions tied to revised trade enforcement demands. One participant later described the exchange as strategically incompatible from the first 5 minutes. Washington expected urgency. Ottawa responded with process. That frustrated officials inside the West Wing almost immediately. The Americans wanted visible movement. Carney's government instead expanded consultations with provincial premiers, trade lawyers, intelligence coordinators, energy officials, and allied embassies. Meetings multiplied quietly across Ottawa, London, Brussels, and Tokyo. Supply chain assessments were updated, export dependencies were mapped sector by sector. Contingency frameworks moved from theoretical planning into operational review. Meanwhile, the White House kept escalating publicly, and every escalation increased institutional anxiety. One by one, corporate risk departments began issuing internal exposure memos. Automotive manufacturers examined assembly vulnerabilities tied to cross-border components. Agricultural exporters reviewed transportation contingencies. Energy firms started modeling retaliatory restrictions. Logistics executives warned that prolonged instability could disrupt billions in integrated North American trade architecture. Then came the market repricing. The reaction was not dramatic at first. That made it more serious. A 2% move here, a currency shift there, slight increases in sovereign risk language inside institutional notes, pension managers quietly reducing exposure to politically vulnerable sectors, insurance pricing adjustments, delayed investment decisions, deferred capital deployment. Economic systems do not collapse all at once. First, they hesitate. That hesitation began spreading through boardrooms faster than politicians realized. In Toronto, executives at major banks reportedly began discussing contingency communications should bilateral tensions intensify further. In New York, investment strategists warned clients that retaliatory escalation between close allies historically produces broader confidence deterioration than conflicts between adversaries, because alliances are supposed to be stable. When stability itself becomes uncertain, investors notice. That was the moment officials realized the crisis was becoming irreversible. The real shock, however, emerged behind closed doors. According to later diplomatic leaks, several Allied governments privately expressed concern that the confrontation was beginning to undermine confidence in broader Western economic coordination. European ministries worried that aggressive bilateral pressure tactics could spread uncertainty across NATO-aligned trade systems already strained by energy transitions, supply chain fragmentation, and geopolitical realignment with China. The issue was no longer Canada. The issue was whether major alliances could still function predictably under pressure, and predictability is the foundation of modern finance. Without it, capital slows, investment contracts, institutions become defensive. Carney appeared to understand this instinctively. His public appearances remained controlled almost to the point of discomfort. No visible anger, no theatrical retaliation, no emotional counterattacks designed for headlines. During one televised appearance, while reporters pressed repeatedly about Trump's latest threats, Carney simply adjusted papers on the podium, paused for several seconds, and responded in a tone so calm that it unsettled commentators afterward. Canada will respond through its institutions, nothing more, no performance. But markets understood the implication immediately. Institutional responses are harder to negotiate against because they operate through systems rather than personalities. Tariffs can be answered with regulations. Pressure can be answered with coordination. Economic coercion can trigger diversification strategies that permanently alter trade behavior. And once those systems begin moving, reversing them becomes extremely expensive. That was the hidden danger facing Washington. Inside U.S. manufacturing sectors, concern quietly intensified over strategic dependency exposure. Defense suppliers flagged mineral vulnerabilities linked to Canadian resources. Energy analysts warned about long-term infrastructure cooperation risks. Agricultural groups pressured lawmakers privately to avoid retaliatory spirals that could destabilize export predictability, but publicly the rhetoric kept escalating. Television networks framed the confrontation like political theater. Markets treated it like structural risk. There is a difference. Political theater seeks attention. Structural risk changes behavior. By the second week, foreign ministries across Europe and Asia were conducting scenario analyses on the possibility of prolonged North American trade fragmentation. Intelligence briefings referenced increasing geopolitical recalibration among mid-sized allied economies seeking to reduce exposure to unpredictable bilateral tensions. Quietly, governments began asking uncomfortable questions. If the United States could apply this level of pressure against Canada, what would happen during future disputes involving security guarantees, technology transfers, semiconductor access, energy coordination, or Arctic governance. The alliance itself was being repriced, and that repricing carried consequences far beyond tariffs. Trade wars are expensive, ego-driven trade wars become historic. What happened next changed the negotiation permanently. During a closed-door strategy session in Ottawa, Canadian officials reportedly reviewed retaliatory pathways that extended far beyond traditional tariff responses. Telecommunications cooperation, critical minerals, procurement frameworks, energy coordination, infrastructure permitting, Arctic transit oversight, defense industrial alignment. The list was extensive, not because Canada wanted escalation, because strategic leverage cuts both ways. For decades, North American integration created extraordinary efficiency, but integration also creates mutual vulnerability. The deeper the interdependence, the greater the disruption potential when political trust erodes. Carney understood that reality with almost clinical precision. He did not need to threaten dramatically. He only needed Washington to realize that prolonged instability carried costs large enough to reshape investor psychology, and slowly that realization began spreading. At 8:03 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, one major U.S. business network interrupted programming to discuss rising concerns from multinational CEOs regarding cross-border governance uncertainty. The language sounded technical. It was not. Governance uncertainty is financial code for institutional distrust. Once investors begin pricing distrust into long-term planning models, economic damage compounds silently. Factories delay expansion, supply chains diversify, capital moves cautiously, hiring slows, insurance costs rise, credit conditions tighten incrementally, not through panic, through hesitation. That hesitation became visible everywhere. In Washington restaurants near K Street, lobbyists exchanged rumors about possible exemptions. On Bay Street in Toronto, traders monitored overnight currency flows with growing tension. Brussels diplomats spoke more openly about strategic autonomy. Asian sovereign funds requested updated North American political risk assessments. The pressure campaign was no longer producing submission, it was producing recalculation. And recalculation changes history slowly, then suddenly. Behind the scenes, senior administration officials reportedly became frustrated by Carney's refusal to personalize the conflict. Traditional political pressure mechanisms rely heavily on emotional engagement. Public confrontation creates negotiation momentum. Escalation forces reaction. Reaction creates leverage. But Carney consistently denied the emotional battlefield itself. Instead of answering pressure with anger, he answered it with committees, frameworks, institutional reviews, and coordinated policy language. It looked bureaucratic on television. In reality, it was strategic containment, because emotional negotiations move fast, institutional negotiations move carefully, and careful systems are harder to destabilize. One diplomat later described the contrast bluntly. Trump negotiated like a television producer. Carney negotiated like a central banker during a currency crisis. The difference became impossible to ignore. By month's end, economists at multiple firms warned that prolonged tensions could reduce North American growth projections by nearly 0.7% over 18 months if retaliatory measures expanded further. Manufacturing indexes softened, investor sentiment surveys weakened, cross-border investment outlooks deteriorated. None of it looked catastrophic individually. Together it formed a pattern. Economic systems run on confidence, and confidence is fragile. Then came the strategic turning point. During a multinational summit in Europe, several Allied leaders reportedly expressed private support for Canada's institutional response strategy rather than Washington's escalation posture. The conversations were discreet. Cameras never captured them. Official communiques remained carefully neutral. But diplomatic behavior shifted. Meetings once centered around trade efficiency increasingly focused on resilience against political volatility. New conversations emerged around diversified supply chains, regional manufacturing independence, and strategic autonomy frameworks. The broader Western alliance was adapting psychologically, not against the United States itself, against uncertainty. That distinction mattered enormously, because once allies begin designing systems to reduce dependence on your predictability, Influence begins eroding quietly long before headlines acknowledge it, and influence lost quietly is often the hardest to recover. Inside intelligence assessments, officials reportedly warned that geopolitical competitors were monitoring the situation carefully. Beijing analysts viewed the dispute as evidence of widening fractures inside Western economic coordination. Russian strategic circles interpreted the instability as proof that alliance cohesion remained vulnerable under sustained pressure. Global rivals study stress points carefully, especially financial stress points. The confrontation was now generating consequences across diplomatic, economic, and security domains simultaneously. But the real damage had not yet begun. The deeper issue emerging underneath the conflict involved sovereign credibility itself. International systems depend heavily on assumptions about continuity. Investors assume agreements remain stable. Allies assume frameworks survive leadership changes. Markets assume economic relationships will not suddenly become political weapons without warning. When those assumptions weaken, everything becomes more expensive. Debt financing, infrastructure investment, trade insurance, long-term industrial planning, even trust itself develops a price tag. That was the hidden cost spreading beneath the headlines. And Carney kept reinforcing the same message with almost relentless discipline. Canada would not respond emotionally. Canada would respond structurally. The language sounded restrained. The implications were enormous, because structural responses outlive news cycles. At one point, after another round of public escalation from Washington, reporters waited outside an Ottawa government building for nearly 40 minutes, expecting a retaliatory announcement. Officials emerged slowly through glass doors carrying briefing folders and speaking quietly among themselves. Cameras pushed forward. No announcement came. Only a short statement confirming continued institutional coordination with international partners. Financial analysts later described that moment as psychologically devastating for negotiators expecting visible panic. There was none. Calm can become a form of leverage when everyone else is escalating. And the markets noticed. Currency volatility began stabilizing around Canadian positions, while risk concerns increasingly concentrated around political unpredictability itself. Bond markets, often far colder and more analytical than equity traders, appeared to signal growing confidence that Ottawa's institutional posture would remain consistent regardless of political pressure. Consistency matters, especially during crises. By contrast, every unexpected escalation from Washington widened uncertainty premiums further. Analysts started using phrases once reserved for emerging market instability: policy unpredictability, retaliatory risk exposure, institutional signaling deterioration. For many officials, hearing those terms associated with the United States felt surreal. But systems do not care about pride. Markets do not reward emotion. And leverage becomes dangerous when overused. The historical parallels began attracting attention. Economists referenced previous moments when major powers underestimated the long-term costs of coercive economic behavior against allies. Historians noted that global influence often declines not through military defeat, but through gradual erosion of institutional trust. One sentence circulated widely among international strategists during the height of the confrontation. The problem was not the negotiation itself. The problem was what the negotiation revealed. What it revealed was unsettling. It revealed how fragile Allied confidence becomes when political escalation overrides institutional stability. It revealed how quickly global capital begins reassessing assumptions once unpredictability enters core economic relationships. It revealed that modern power depends less on dominance than on reliability, and reliability cannot be demanded through pressure alone. Near the end of the standoff, one final scene captured the entire psychological contrast. In Washington, officials moved rapidly between meetings as reporters shouted questions across crowded hallways. Phones rang continuously. Advisors argued near elevators. Television screens flashed urgent banners about retaliation, markets, negotiations, leverage. In Ottawa, Carney walked slowly toward a podium inside a quiet government chamber. He adjusted his notes, looked briefly toward reporters, then paused. No anger, no performance, just controlled restraint. And in that moment, something became unmistakably clear to governments around the world. One side was trying to win the confrontation, the other side was trying to outlast it. History tends to remember which strategy survives longer, because geopolitical conflicts are rarely decided by speeches alone. They are decided by systems, incentives, endurance, institutional confidence, capital flows, strategic patience. The countries that shape history are often not the loudest. They are the most predictable under pressure. As the crisis slowly stabilized, global markets recovered cautiously, but the psychological damage lingered. Supply chain diversification accelerated. Allied governments intensified resilience planning. Investors quietly adjusted long-term assumptions about North American political risk. Nothing collapsed overnight. That is not how structural shifts happen. Instead, thousands of small decisions began moving in the same direction simultaneously. Factories, investors, diplomats, central banks, defense planners, trade ministries, pension funds, all recalibrating, all responding to the same realization. Power is not only measured by how much pressure a country can apply, it is measured by how much instability it creates when it does. And somewhere inside those tense negotiations, vibrating phones, closed briefing folders, delayed responses, and silent market calculations, Mark Carney delivered the kind of response Donald Trump never expected. Not emotional resistance, not theatrical outrage, institutional patience. In the end, that may have been the more powerful weapon, because economic warfare has changed. Modern conflicts are no longer fought only through tariffs, sanctions, or military deployments. They are fought through confidence, predictability, systems integration, and strategic endurance. The winners are often determined long before the public understands the game being played. And by the time history identifies the turning point, the real decisions have already been made behind closed doors, quietly, calmly, irreversibly. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.